Welcome, Dr. Epic here. And what we're going to encounter in this section is Egyptian graffiti, the pyramid robots, bones bulls, and the solution to who built the pyramids. There's the second half of the outline right up above me. I'd put that in your notes, and let's go ahead and get started. And we're first going to talk about stars, the night sky itself. We know the Egyptians looked at the night sky. The Egyptians had a working knowledge of astronomy. They weren't into it. They were not really into plotting the movement of the stars like the Babylonians or the Chaldeans or the Greeks were, but they knew the stars were up there. They didn't give the night sky any special importance. And we know this because we have artistic representations of the Egyptian night sky. And in particular, we have this one right here. This is the tomb of Ramses VI from the New Kingdom. And you can clearly see in his tomb chamber, directly above his sarcophagus, you have depicted the night sky. That sort of long yellow band, that's the goddess of the night sky, Mut. And all of those individual yellow figures around her, those are the stars of the night sky. But it seems that the Egyptians were not particularly interested in things like constellations. They didn't really see any patterns in the stars. They just knew that certain stars kind of occurred together, but they just did not get especially interested in any of them. The one spot in the night sky that they were really interested in was the North Star, the point in the sky at which the other stars move around. They were really interested in that one area, and that is in fact near the head of the goddess Mut, right up above me. But for the most part, the Big Dipper, the Little Dipper, Ursa Major, Ursa Minor, Scorpio, all those other constellations, they just didn't really care about them that much. And in this tomb chamber, there is the stars that make up the figure Orion, but they are given no special importance. They knew the stars were in there. They knew where the stars were. They just didn't really care all that much. Does this have an impact on our hypothesis that they knew the belt of Orion was in the sky and they didn't care about it? The answer is it should, because we're going to return to something we discussed earlier, which is the Orion correlation theory. On your left, there is the sky itself. There is the constellation Orion. It's supposed to look like a hunter with his one hand up. And the three stars in the middle, that's the belt of Orion. And those are the names of the stars of Orion right there. And remember, in hypothesis 2, the higher powers hypothesis, the three pyramids of the Giza complex are supposed to line up with the belt of Orion. Or they're supposed to line up exactly with how the stars were 10,000 years ago. But here's the rub. They don't. The pyramids of the Giza, the Great Pyramids of Egypt, the pyramids of Giza, do not align with the three stars of Orion. The images right up above are photo manipulated to make you think that. Actually, the pyramids of Giza are laid out south to north, but if you look up in the night sky, the pyramids go like this, but the belt of Orion goes like that. In other words, you have to take the night sky and completely flip it upside down for the three stars of Orion to line up with the pyramids of Egypt. And even then, the star way out on one end, the star Mintaka, it doesn't line up with the pyramid of Menkaure. And so when Graham Hancock and Robert Bauval first published on the Orion correlation theory, when the stars didn't line up exactly, even after they flipped the night sky and the Mintaka star didn't line up, they merely manipulated the photograph. They cut out the star and moved it into a position where it would match the pyramids. In other words, the Orion correlation theory is completely and totally false. The three great pyramids of Giza do not align to the belt of Orion. Now, I'm going to start talking about the archaeology of the pyramids themselves and the archaeology that was conducted on the Giza Plateau, inside the pyramids, around the edges of the Giza complex. But I want to point out this thing. A lot of students ask me like where this information comes from, and you know, we're only really dipping our toe into Egyptian archaeology. But if you're really interested in stuff like this, this is the book that I would recommend. Mark Lehner's Complete Pyramids, from first published 1997. It's basically a very encyclopedic book talking about all known Egyptian pyramids. It's a very, very good book. Mark Lehner is the guy that built that pyramid that we talked about earlier. Mark Lehner, and we'll meet him again in just a tick. But Mark Lehner documented all of these pyramids. And if you really want a big, thick, attractive-looking book that's packed full of information about the archaeology of the pyramids, about the architecture of the pyramids, about the artistry of the pyramids, this is the one to go for. And it's very, very attractive, sitting on somebody's coffee table or in somebody's art library. It's an excellent book. And there's also been like 8 or 9 different editions, so if you want a used copy, you can pick up one pretty cheap. Now, there is writing inside the pyramids. There is graffiti that has been noted inside these little crawl spaces and inside these little workers' shafts and inside the architecture itself of the pyramids. And this is graffiti that's been documented from the Pyramid of Menkaure, the smallest of the 3 pyramids of Giza. And in terms of this graffiti, I want to talk about 2 things that are important about this graffiti. One is where the graffiti is, and the second thing is what the graffiti actually says. And I want you to look at this drawing up above, and I want you to note that you can't actually see or read all of the graffiti. Some of the graffiti on these stones, like you'll have a block of stone, and you'll have some characters written on it, but there's another block directly right in front that obscures the lower part of the writing. And that means, in fact, you can see one of those examples right up there. In other words, the graffiti had to be written on the stone before the stone was placed inside the pyramid. So they're writing on the sides of these bricks, and they're placing the bricks in the pyramid, and then they're sticking other bricks on top. And sometimes it's obscuring some of the graffiti. And you can see clearly in the illustration above, some of the graffiti goes off in unknown areas, and we can't actually read all of the graffiti because it's part of the construction now. The second thing is what the graffiti actually says. And this is the graffiti from the Pyramid of Menkaure. And basically, it's a series of names and taunts, because basically it seems to be 2 different groups of individuals. One group calling itself the Friends of Menkaure, and another group calling itself the Drunks of Menkaure. And they're basically carving the names, they're carving the name of their work crews on the stones as the stones are being put inside the pyramid. And they are very, very proud that they are working on the pyramid itself. And this is going to cause big problems for 2 of our hypotheses. The fact that we have graffiti, it is graffiti that is being written on the stones prior to the stones being put in the pyramid. The graffiti is in Egyptian, and the groups, the work crews, the people building the pyramid are bragging about how much work they're doing, and they're literate. Here is some other graffiti. This is from the Pyramid of Khufu, and you can see that again. I want to stress where the graffiti is and what the graffiti actually says. So here is the main chamber inside the Pyramid of Khufu, and you can see that the main chamber is right there. But in order so that the roof wouldn't eventually collapse, what they did is they built a series of stacked roofs directly on top of the main on top of the king's chamber. And these little spaces, they have names for them like Wellington's chamber and Nelson's chamber and Davidson's chamber. But these are not ever like places that people were ever expected to crawl into. It is merely an engineering element that is able to push the weight of the stones above it away from the roofs of the king's chamber. So you have these little tiny little crawl spaces as engineering elements right up to the arch that fits over the top of the chamber itself, right above Campbell's chamber. So these are never places that you are expected to get into after they had been constructed. And there's still graffiti in there. I mean, you can see from the drawing on the left, there's graffiti inside these tiny little crawl spaces. And the graffiti extends into like beyond other stones, because we don't actually know what all the graffiti says, because the graffiti was obviously placed on the stone before the stone was placed in the pyramid. And again, what does the graffiti actually say? And there is some of the graffiti right up above me. That is the name of the pharaoh Khufu himself. His name is on one of the blocks, and you can see that the cartouche that represents Khufu's name extends below the floor. In other words, Khufu's name was written on that stone before that stone was placed in the pyramid. So whoever these pyramid workers are, they are clearly literate. They are clearly writing in Egyptian. And again, there is some degree of pride in what they're doing. Robots in the pyramids. Robots in the pyramids. There are robots inside the Great Pyramids. Now, what do I mean by that? They're not ancient robots. These are modern robots. This is one of the cutting edges of pyramid archaeology. And it's been known, ever since the 19th century, it's been known that there's these tiny little ventilation shafts that extend outward from the chambers and the hallways of the main pyramid complex. The main pyramid architecture itself has these little tiny ventilation shafts that extend all the way to the edge of the structure. And sometimes they only extend about 2/3 of the way. And there on the upper left, you can see some of these ventilation shafts mapped out. Of course, that isn't to scale. You can see the shafts there on the left. I mean, these things are they're like this big. I mean, they're really, really far too small for anyone to crawl into. And about 15 years ago, archaeologists got the idea of what if we could put something up in one of these shafts? What if we could put a probe up in these shafts or see what's there? And they went one better. Let's build little robot drones and send these little crawling robots up the ventilation shafts of the pyramids, and we get to see what's actually there. And you can see right up above my yellow box, these are some of the robots they've built to crawl up inside these little shafts. Their original robot was up there on the upper left. The current one is Djeti. He's on the lower right. And that's what they've been doing for the past 10 or 15 years, sending these tiny little robots into these secret tiny little pyramid spot places in the pyramid to see what's there. And they actually found stuff. They found graffiti, they found broken tools, they found broken measuring devices. And as you see on the upper left, that's a diagram of one of these tiny little pyramid robots crawling his way through the ventilation shafts. And this is what they've found. They've found graffitis, they've found lines indicating where blocks should be put. Some of them are very, very simple construction instructions. Like that dot, it pretty much just means this side up. But they've also found broken bronze tools. There's a bronze hook right up above me that they recovered from inside one of these ventilation shafts, where it had been broken during the construction of the pyramid and left in one of these ventilation shafts for 5,000 years. That little broken tool had been sitting in the ventilation shaft before it was discovered by one of our little pyramid robots. And there on the lower left, there's some other artifacts they have recovered. This perfectly sphere granite ball. That's probably a level. So you place a stone in the pyramid. You want to make sure that your stone is not slanted, even 1 or 2 degrees, because that's going to cause a lot of problems. So as soon as your stone is placed, you put this ball in the middle of your stone, and if the ball starts rolling, that tells you that your limestone block, isn't level. You have to wedge it in there. And they also recovered another one of these measuring rods that is exactly 1 cubit in length. So they are recovering graffiti, they're recovering construction marks, they're recovering broken tools that haven't been touched since the days of the construction itself. They didn't find any iron, they didn't find any steel, they found no like advanced alien technology at all, just simple bronze tools. And these things are so small, these ventilation shafts are so small, there is absolutely no way anyone could have crawled up in there and placed it after the tomb, after the pyramid itself had been constructed. And this should cause a lot of problems for one of our hypotheses. Now, in the 1990s, a pair of archaeologists, Zawi Hawass and Mark Lehner, began excavations in a large cemetery to the south and west of the Great Pyramids of Giza. And this was a very, very simple cemetery. You can see it right up above me. It had basically just a series of small mastabas placed over these very kind of modest tombs. And these mastabas were very crudely built. In fact, it looks like they were constructed out of odd pieces left over from the construction of the Great Pyramids themselves. So they're building these mastabas from the rubble left over from the construction of Giza. And you can see in the photograph right up above me, that's one of the Great Pyramids, like right there. It's right next to the cemetery. And once they started going inside these tombs, they discovered hieroglyphs at the entrance of these tombs. And very crude hieroglyphs indicated names, and more importantly, they indicated titles. The people who are buried in these very simple mastabas give their name and they give their title. And they are very, very proud of what they did because they helped build the pyramids. And they're intensely proud of this. And the titles include things like Pyramid Overseer, Director of the Draftsman, Chief Mason, Chief Inspector. These people are literate and they are intensely proud of this great construction project that they helped with, the pyramid. And inside the tomb itself, they recovered, and other archaeologists have continued to recover, dozens of intact human remains. There are people buried in those tombs. But here's the thing. These tombs, these mastabas seem to have functioned like family crypts. There's whole families buried in there. And there's artwork that depicts the family at life and work. These are entire families. It isn't just 70, 80, 90% men. The workers who worked on the pyramids and are proud of having worked on the pyramids lived with their families, okay? The cemetery holds entire families, not just adult men. Women, adolescents, children, entire families used these tombs. And in fact, 2 or 3 generations even after the pyramids were constructed, they continued to use the family crypts that were located next to the Great Pyramids of Egypt. The workers are obviously living with their families. An osteological analysis of the bones themselves showed that these people were in very, very good shape. Their bones are generally free from malnutrition. They are free from disease. They're very healthy. They have, I mean, good Lord, look at those teeth, they're perfect. They had very few indicators of malnutrition, very few indicators of disease. Now, they did have very distinct arthritis. They had arthritis located along their spine and in their shoulders. In other words, this is the type of arthritis, the type of bone wear that you would develop if you spent, say, several decades hauling very heavy loads. There are injuries among these pyramid workers. The injuries are generally broken ulnas, broken tibias, these are lower arm, lower leg, cracked humeruses. But here's the thing about the injury, about those insults to their bone. And it works like this. If you break your arm, you need to go to a bone setter, because unless the 2 ends of the bones are put back into place, the bone isn't going to heal correctly, which is why when you break something, you have to go to a doctor. And in societies where people are treated very badly or they don't have access to medical care, when you break a bone, it heals off angle, or it will heal very crookedly or with a twist to it. But if you go to a doctor, if you go to a bone setter, and they set the bone and they immobilize the limb, and then you don't put any weight or stress on that limb, the bone will heal almost like it has never been broken. And the only thing you'll have left are these tiny little hairline scars that indicate that the bone was broken at all. And that's the kind of scars that are present on these bones. A lot of these guys have broken bones, but they received medical attention. Their bones were set. The limb was immobilized with a splint or a cast, and they didn't work while their bones were healing. The osteological evidence from the cemetery of the pyramid workers should cause a lot of problems for one of our hypotheses. But we haven't even gotten to the problems. Even bigger problems for that same hypothesis is just about to come. Because as Zahi Hawass and Mark Lehner were exploring the edges of the cemetery, they did a series of explorations beyond the edge of the necropolis itself. And they discovered the remains of the workers' camp. More importantly, the remains of the kitchen, this large communal kitchen, and the midden that was attached to that kitchen. Now, a midden is a garbage dump. So you have this huge kitchen, and I'll show you a picture of the kitchen in a bit. So you have this huge kitchen, which would deliver these big meals to the people who are working on the pyramids. And at the end of the day, they would take all this garbage and bury it in the desert. And that's what Mark Lehner and Zahi Hawass excavated. Because often, it isn't the great tombs that really give you really good information. It isn't, this funerary architecture that really gives you an idea of how the society operated. It's a society's garbage that will tell you the truth about a society, something we will talk all about later. And this is what the garbage from the pyramid workers' camp tells us. It told us that the pyramid workers ate very, very well, okay? That the chief thing that they consumed, the chief source of meat, was young bulls aged between 8 and 16 months. And you can tell how old the bull was when it was butchered due to the size of the bones. So basically, they're gathering together all these bulls from across Egypt, bringing them to the pyramid work site, butchering them, and feeding them to the workers. This is good eating. This is prime rib. That's like the best kind of meat you can get. Most people in Egypt did not eat that way. Most people today don't eat as well as the pyramid workers ate. The pyramid workers ate very well, and we know this because the archaeological evidence clearly shows these guys are eating prime rib from the bones of these bulls that were butchered to feed them, aged 8 to 16 months. And here's the question you need to ask yourself: is this typical of the treatment of slaves? Now, this is what that kitchen actually looked like. There's a map of the kitchen right up above my yellow box. And on the left is a photograph of people excavating the kitchens. Basically, the kitchens consisted of an open eating area and these huge areas where they're cooking all that meat, and these enormous bakeries where they're cooking, producing large numbers of very high quality, very dense Egyptian bread. But then, attached to the bakery and attached to the kitchen was another area. And that's actually what I'm going to talk about, because that's what they're doing there on the left. Because in this third area, this third part of the kitchen, they found these really huge, like, I don't know, what is that, like a 40-gallon ceramic pot? These really big ceramic pots that were partially buried in the earth where they would be cool and be protected. And they could not for the life of them figure out what they're doing in these huge half-buried pots. What could they possibly be making there? So what they did is they took some residue samples from inside these ceramic vessels, and they sent them to a laboratory to be scanned with a scanning electron microscope. And those are photographs from the results of the scanning electron microscope that was studying the residue from inside these buried ceramic vessels. And what they did is they discovered the remains of, well, that's what the pictures are. They're basically starch granules that have been broken down and pitted. So basically they've been heated and then exposed to boiling water with caustic elements to sort of break them down and to spill out their material into the liquid. But also present, they detected elements of yeast and elements of malt. And everything had been sort of placed together and left to sit in this half-buried pot under the ground, and then probably covered over for a length of time. So now I want you to cogitate. What are they making in this third part of the kitchen? They're taking grain, they're boiling it, they're putting it in an underground pot, and they're mixing in yeast and malt, and then covering it to let it sit there a while. So that's how we get this caustic chemical reaction. What are they making? And what are they making for the pyramid workers? Hopefully you've already figured it out. They're making beer. That third part of the kitchen was the brewery. And in fact, they've taken the results from the archaeology, reverse engineered the recipe, and you can buy the beer that has been engineered from the archaeological evidence. It's called Tutankhamun Ale. It's very expensive. And they've tailored it for modern sensibilities. Apparently, the original recipe would have made for like really crunchy beer. The Egyptians apparently liked their beer with lots of like stuff in it. It was very, very heavy, and they liked it with like bits of the yeast and barley and stuff inside of it. So for modern audiences, they sweetened it and filtered it a little bit more. But yeah, you can buy beer that was created from the ancient recipe and drink what the pyramid workers were drinking. So in other words, let's recap what we have from the archaeology at the Giza Plateau. Okay, so the pyramid workers, they lived with their families. They continued to use the mastabas long after the pyramids were finished. They had health care with time to recover from their injuries. They had an excellent diet. They ate very well. Their diet was meat-rich, it was bread-heavy, and served with freshly brewed beer. They were literate, and they were intensely proud of what they did. They were intensely proud of having worked on the Great Pyramids of Egypt. Does this cause any problems for any of our hypotheses to date? Does the archaeological evidence from the pyramid workers recovered from the Giza Plateau, does it agree with the known attributes of slave societies? Does it? Now, you have everything you need. We have our three hypotheses. The historical hypothesis, slaves built the pyramids. Hypothesis number 2, higher powers built the pyramids, or at least directed the construction of the pyramids. And then hypothesis 3, the null hypothesis, that everything else must be wrong and a new hypothesis must be proposed. So, you have all the information you need. Which of these is the simplest and therefore the most likely? Which of these is the most complex and therefore the most unlikely? Aliens, Atlanteans, slave drivers? What does the evidence support? And if the evidence doesn't support anything else, what must you do? And what sort of new models might emerge about the construction of the Great Pyramids of Egypt? You have all the information needed to answer that question right there. Who built the pyramids of Egypt? Evaluate the three hypotheses given about the construction of the Great Pyramids of Giza. Which is the simplest and therefore the most likely? Which is the least likely? Which is supported by current archaeological evidence? And when you give your answer to this, your answer must be supported by specific archaeological evidence. You can't just say, oh, the pyramid workers ate well. You have to give the evidence proving that the pyramid workers ate well. You can't just say, oh, well, we know that the pyramid workers were literate. No, you have to give the evidence that explains how we know the pyramid workers were literate. Now, archaeological research on the Giza Plateau continues, and it continues to this current day. And you never know what sort of new things will be discovered. And, this is why hypotheses are always changing. And in 2013, they discovered one of the oldest papyruses ever discovered in Egypt. It's called the Merer Papyrus. And you can look it up online. There's a fragment of it right up above. But basically, the Merer papyrus appears to be a document, a diary written during the construction of the Great Pyramids of Giza. And it's roughly 4,600 years old. It was stored in a cave in the desert. And basically what the Merer papyrus says, just very, very quickly, it's written by a guy called Merer. He's recording daily activities. He appears to be a kind of like logistics or teamster inspector. And specifically the fragment that has survived and can be read discusses Merer moving high quality limestone across Egypt. And he's inspecting the limestone to make sure it's good enough to be placed on the outside of the pyramid itself. In other words, it's a direct historical document describing the logistics of the construction of the Great Pyramids. Does this cause any problems for any of our hypotheses? For any of our hypotheses? Well, it should. You now have all the information to answer that question, and you're going to proceed to answer that question, first informally and then in a much more formal test. We are now finished with our section on Egypt, and we're going to go forth and climb into the next module, in the next section, and I will see you there.